Okay.
Let
So
me.
everybody, uh, good night, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So our second lecture of the US patent webinar series starts now. Today we are honored to have our guest speaker, Josh. And let me make a brief introduction of Josh in Chinese, since I believe most of our audience are from China.
Okay.
今天我们的讲课嘉宾呢是约书亚·普利切特博士啊。约书亚博士呢，同时具有美国专利代理人以及美国律师的资质啊，也是美国的这个知名知识产权律师事务所啊，有多达这个50-60年历史的知识产权事务所 Hauptmann Ham 的合伙人。约书亚博士呢，具有化学工程学士的这个理工科背景，同时还兼修材料科学专业。在加入 Hauptmann Ham 律师事务所之前呢，这个 Joshua 博士呢，还在 USPTO 担任过专利审查员任职超过9年。Joshua 博士呢，实际上之前也到中国就是我们中国知识产权培训中心举办的这个针对企业以及知识产权代理事务所代理人的这种线下的专门培训专门教授高质量专利撰写这门课程。那今天呢，我们很荣幸呢有这个机会再次请到约书亚博士呢，通过线上的方式将他这个精彩的课程呢给大家做一个分享。当然这一次呢，因为时间关系，很显然约书亚博士呢没办法将他的所有的这个精髓内容呢给大家这个讲授但是呢仍然会通过一些案例来给大家展示高质量美国专利撰写需要遵循的一些原则和注意事项。那好，接下来呢，我们就有请这个约书亚博士。Now, let's warmly welcome Dr. Joshua. And Joshua, now the floor is yours. Take it away.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah,
So
I
let
will try
me.
to stop sharing so you can share.
I believe you can see my screen now, correct?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join this presentation, and thank you to the host for um, putting this together. Um, in in today's current pandemic situation, it's really hard to have a chance to meet in person. So having these types of introductions is very helpful, and so I thank you very much. And so the presentation today is going to talk a little bit about some application drafting guidelines. And these are really focused on preparing the application to go into the US. And so these are things that you should probably consider when you are initially preparing the application to be filed in China or to be filed as a PCT in China in order to avoid or reduce the risk of some issues when you enter the United States. And one of the things that we'll talk about both today and then on Friday are the fact that the laws are different. This doesn't mean that one way is the right way and one way is the wrong way. The laws are just different. So, in order to be as correct as possible in different countries, we need to adjust our expectations, maybe add a little bit of extra information into the application, adjust the way that we make arguments in order to take advantage of what the laws are in the country that we are seeking to get patent protection. So whenever I'm talking about the US way or anything like that, please don't think that I'm intending to say that this is the right way to do things. I'm saying this is how the US law suggests that things should be done. So today we are going to talk about the application drafting. And we're going to start with some general guidelines. And we'll talk about different pieces of the application in order to help you understand how each piece of the application should be drafted or modified when you go into the US in order to maximize your scope of protection in the US. So the first thing is the title. The title should be as broad as possible and still consistent with the broadest claims, so the independent claims. Typically, what we will do in our practice is we will look at the preamble of each of the independent claims and try to put that into the title. So if we have a semiconductor device and a method of manufacturing, that would indicate in our practice that the claim set at the end of the claim has at least one independent claim that's directed to a semiconductor device and another claim set that's directed to a method of making the semiconductor device. It's a good idea to have your title capture all of the different types of independent claims that you would have in your claim set. So if you are going to have a computer-based invention, often the way that we would draft that is to say some type of system, a method of implementing the system, and a computer readable medium that stores the information something like that, so that we have three different pieces to the title because we would have three different independent claims. Okay. One of the things that very frequently happens when somebody is filing an application in the US from outside of the US is that there are additional descriptive terms in the title. So when there are additional terms in the title, there is a risk that a US court may limit the scope of infringement to only cover competitors' products that are consistent with the title. So if we have going back to our computer example, if we have in the title a mobile device system, if the competitor's product is executed on a server, which is stationary and not able to be moved, that raises a little bit of a question for should a patent application with the title of mobile device system, should that be infringed by a device that is incapable of being moved, something that is not mobile? And whether we win or lose that argument during infringement, we want to try to avoid that argument if at all possible. And it is much less expensive and much easier to fix and avoid problems during prosecution than it would be during an infringement proceeding. So along those lines, make sure that we don't add extra features into the claim, and we don't want to rely on the inventor title, that the title that the inventor initially gives, because the inventor is going to give us a lot more information. Just because they know the technology so well, they're going to put extra information into the title. So this is something that we should consider when we are either entering the national stage of the US or entering the US by a bypass continuation of a PCT or something like that. The next section is the field or technical field. Now, throughout this presentation, you'll notice that my headings say field or technical field and not field of the invention. And we don't talk about background of the invention or summary of the invention. The reason for this is we really try to avoid using the term invention in our specifications in the US. Because when we talk about the invention, we talk about everything that the patent should cover. So if we say the invention is capable of performing this function, if a competitor's product is not capable of performing that function, then courts may interpret the patent as being different from the competitor's product, and therefore there would be no risk of infringement. So we want to say the field or technical field instead of field of the invention. So we should not say field of the invention. So this section in general is not required by the MPEP. The MPEP is the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure. And I'll refer to the MPEP at various times today and on Friday. And this is basically the USPTO kind of rules and regulations for the USPTO. The MPEP does not affect the courts, although some of the things the court does will affect the USPTO guidelines. Okay, so the MPEP is basically the manual, the directions for the examiners at the USPTO for how to examine patent applications. So the MPEP does not require a technical field. So you can just omit this section when you enter the US. It's not required at all. If you do have this feature, then what we recommend is basically that you take the title of the application and write that as a sentence. That's what we would recommend for the field. So if we have a semiconductor device and a method of manufacturing, then our field would be something like, this description includes a semiconductor device and a method of manufacturing, period. That's all that we would say. Now, if you want to be a little bit more detailed with the technical field, you can add a little bit more where you say, especially or specifically a semiconductor device having some sort of insulation material or something like that. But
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again?
But if we add, excuse me, if we add that extra bit of information, we want to make sure that that extra information we add is present in every independent claim. If it's not present in every independent claim, we are increasing the risk of narrowing our claim scope, our scope for infringement, by including that information in the field. So do not include that feature in the field. To go back briefly to the discussion of avoiding the use of the term invention, typically what we will use instead of invention are words like aspects, embodiments, or implementations. Myself, I use the term embodiments. So I will say in some embodiments, the device has this function. In some embodiments, these two elements are connected together. This is the language that I use when I'm describing the invention without using the term invention. So in the background, this is one of the sections that is fairly different in the US than a lot of other places. And again, notice this is the background, not background of the invention. And in the background, basically what we want to talk about in the US is what is the prior art? What is the current state of the technology? We do not want to talk about problems with the prior art. We don't want in the US to use the problem solution approach. The reason for that is when we talk about the problem solution approach, we are providing a motivation for the examiner to make a 103 rejection, which is an obviousness or inventive step type rejection. We're providing the examiner with that type of information to make that rejection in our own application. And we don't want to help the examiner to reject our claims. We also don't want to characterize the prior art too much, because if we say a problem with the prior art is that the prior art is incapable of connecting these two elements in a secure manner. If a competitor's product that we try to enforce our patent against has a problem connecting the two elements, then this will be additional evidence that the competitor's product is different from our patent. So this is something that is very different in the US from a lot of other jurisdictions that use the problem solution approach. We in the US want to just describe what is the state of technology. What is the current technology without any description of whether this is good, whether this is bad. So typically, we only want to write 1 to maybe 1.5 pages. The more that we write in the background, the larger the risk that we will accidentally say something that may cause problems later on. So when we are drafting the background, sometimes when the inventor gives us the initial invention disclosure, they will include some prior art or some background information. We need to be very careful when we are discussing this with the inventor about whether this information is available to the public. So here, sometimes the inventors will mention an old way of doing things, and this is the old way of doing things inside the company. And if the inventor tells us, oh, this is the old way, and then we write that into the background as the current state of technology, then there is a risk that we are disclosing trade secret information. In addition, the US examiners will treat anything that we say in the background as prior art. Now, there are some arguments where we can try to avoid that interpretation, but it creates more problems if we're describing something that should not be publicly described in the background. So be careful. Whenever the inventor describes something as the old way, just ask a question during the interview with the inventor. Hey, is this actually known outside of the company or only inside the company? Just that quick question will help you determine whether or not to include that information in the background. The summary section is again something that is not required in the US. Now, in Europe, the summary section is the longest portion of the application in a lot of situations. In the US, we can completely avoid the summary section. And that is typically what we do as our general practice. Now, if you decide that you want to include the summary section, what we recommend that you do is to write the independent claims as a paragraph. So each independent claim would be its own paragraph in the summary section. And this is something that we have found does satisfy a lot of the requirements outside of the US. And what I mean by writing the independent claim as a paragraph would be something like, an aspect of this description relates to a semiconductor device, period. The semiconductor device includes a substrate of semiconductor material, period. The semiconductor device further includes an insulation feature in the substrate, period. And so each element of the claim would be one sentence. And put together the sentences, and that's the paragraph to describe the independent claim. That's the way that we would draft a summary if our client requested a summary to be included. And one of the other things that we should avoid in the summary is to describe the object or the purpose of the invention. This is something that, again, goes along with the problem solution approach. And we will talk about on Friday some arguments that can avoid an obviousness rejection or an inventive step rejection that are based on what we say is render unsatisfactory for the intended purpose. So if we can avoid in our application talking about the intended purpose or the object of the invention, this will help us to prevent competitors from making those arguments and getting broader patent terms, getting broader patent scope, which then our client has to deal with in order to sell their product. So the summary, at the very least, it should be just summary, not summary of the invention. This can be completely omitted in the US, but if you want to include it, we would recommend that you only write the independent claims as paragraphs instead of as a claim format. So the brief description of the drawings. When we describe the brief description of the drawings, again, we want to use terms like aspects, embodiments, or implementations, not of the invention. So that is something that we strongly recommend. One of the other things that we will sometimes see in the brief description of the drawings is we'll see something that says figure 1 is a diagram of a first embodiment. Figure 2 is a diagram of a second embodiment. Figure 3 is a diagram of a third embodiment. There is nothing legally incorrect, or there's no potential legal error there. But what this does is it increases the risk that the U.S. examiner will do an election of species requirement on that application. So for those of you who have never listened to me talk before, I was a previous primary examiner at the USPTO. I was at the USPTO for about 10 years. And, if it's Friday, don't really feel like doing a whole lot of work or something like that, one of the things that I would look at is the brief description of the drawings. And if the brief description of the drawing said first embodiment, second embodiment, third embodiment, then quite often I could just issue an election of species requirement that says you must pick either the first embodiment, the second embodiment, or the third embodiment for examination in this case. And that's something that we really want to try to avoid, because we don't know what prior art the examiner may find. And once we have selected one of the embodiments, we cannot switch during prosecution. We would need to file a divisional application in order to switch which embodiment is going to be examined. So instead of saying first embodiment, second embodiment, third embodiment, we recommend to say something like figure 1 is a view of the device according to some embodiment or some embodiments or at least one embodiment. And what this does is it helps to avoid the clear, distinct lines that separate the different embodiments that are within the description. And this reduces the risk of an election of species requirement. Now, this doesn't completely avoid the election of species requirement, but it does reduce the risk. The USPTO requires that every feature that is in the claim also be shown in at least one figure, if it's at all possible. So, sometimes chemical applications, you can't really show things in the drawings. But if there is a device, any feature that is recited in the claim language must be shown in at least one figure in the drawings. Each drawing should be referred to as the embodiment, as something that we included before. One of the other things that we want to make sure that we do is include some type of computer diagram for computer implemented inventions, for ways of doing business, for manufacturing processes, for some sort of control system, anything that is going to rely on a computer, cloud-based technologies, any of that. We want to make sure that we include a computer diagram that has some hardware components, some specific hardware components in that diagram in order to avoid 101, so 35 USC 101, which is patent eligibility requirements. This is something that in the past, say, 8 or 9 years has been very significant in the United States. So including information in the specification and the drawings that provide clear hardware that is used to implement the system or the method is very important in the United States. If we don't have that, we have had some very, very difficult times obtaining patents, and in some instances, no patent has been granted when the computer elements have been removed. For method claims, we should have some sort of flow chart to show, the sequence of steps, or if it's an electronic device, how the signals move through the system in order to help the examiner to avoid the 101 type of rejections, to give the examiner some basis for avoiding the 101 rejections. Okay, so moving on to the detailed description. Again, detailed description, not detailed description of the invention. And we don't want to say detailed description of the embodiment. That suggests that there's only a single embodiment in the patent application. So we want to say detailed description. So in the detailed description, we want to describe the embodiments that were provided by the inventor, but also during our discussion, we want to ask the inventor about some alternatives. We want to ask the inventor how, if there was a competitor, how would the competitor avoid this product that you're describing to me? How would the competitor avoid this method of manufacturing that you're describing? And we want to try to capture that information in the detailed description as well. That is why we like to use the term embodiments. So the inventor's aspect could be some embodiments, and then the potential design around options could be some embodiments as well. And we don't, for the reasons that we discussed above, we don't like to say In some embodiments and in alternative embodiments, we just use the term some embodiments or at least one embodiment every time. We try not to draw lines between how the embodiments can be combined. One of the other things that we should always include in our detailed description is the criticality of ranges. Criticality of ranges basically means if we have a range in our specification, so we have a thickness from 1 to 5, or a time duration from 1 minute to 10 minutes, something like that. We want to provide in the detailed description why we chose these numbers. Why did we choose a thickness of 1 as the bottom of the range? Why did we choose 5 as the top of the range? And this is useful during prosecution to try to avoid some obviousness or inventive step type rejections where the examiner basically just says, oh, this range is obvious, without providing any prior art or additional explanation to explain why they say that it's obvious. So we call this criticality statements. Why did we choose this range? If possible, we also like to include what we call nested ranges. So if we have a range of 1 to 10, we want to say in some embodiments, the time ranges from 1 to 10. In some embodiments, the time ranges from 2 to 5. And in some embodiments, the time ranges from 3 to 4. And when we provide these ranges, so we had 1 to 10, 2 to 5, 3 to 4, these are what we call nested ranges. So a smaller range described after the larger range. And this helps to allow us, if necessary, to have clear support for amending the claim if the examiner finds prior art that, for example, has a value of 8, right? Some examiners in the US would not allow us to amend the claim to have a value less than 8 if the only disclosure we have is a range from 1 to 10. Some examiners will say that this is new matter if we were to try to amend the claim to have 1 to 7 or something like that. So you want to include how the product is made. So this is part of the enablement requirement in the United States, which requires that the specification include enough detail that someone would know how to make and use the claimed features of the invention. As we talked about before, we want to try to have an expanded list of materials in the detailed description, even if these materials are not likely to be used by your client or your company. The reason to do this, the reason to have the expanded list of materials, is this helps to broaden your claim scope. So if in the specification we say the conductive material is copper, and we always say copper, 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 copper throughout the specification, and then in the claims we say conductive material, and the competitor makes a product that uses aluminum, for example, there is a significant risk that the court may say the claim only covers copper because the specification only uses copper as the only example of the conductive material, and therefore there is no infringement. This is because if the claim is interpreted to cover aluminum, then the claim would not be enabled because aluminum was never mentioned in the specification. So having an expanded list of materials or processes can help to broaden the scope of your claim to capture competitor products that are attempting to design around the invention that we're seeking protection for. So even if the materials are not likely to be used, we want to ask the inventor during the interview what additional materials could be used. You know, you're planning to use only copper, but could you use aluminum? Could you use tungsten? Could you use a conductive polymer? These types of things we want to ask the inventor. We also do not want to describe any of the embodiment as preferred. So going back to the ranges that we talked about, we don't want to say in some embodiments the range is 1 to 10, preferably 2 to 5, most preferably 3 to 4. The reason that we don't want to use terms like prefer is that suggests to the court that we should not expand outside of the initial 1 to 10 range. If we say we prefer these more narrow ranges, that suggests to a court that if a competitor has a product that's operating at 11, you know, right outside the 10, that is not something that would be equivalent to our invention. And so that's something that can potentially limit the scope of the claims during an infringement proceeding. And again, as we've mentioned previously, do not use the term invention if you can at all help it. If you must use the term invention, if your client wants to see it in there, then say embodiments of the invention or examples of the invention. We don't want to just refer to the invention by itself because, again, that is the entire scope that is covered by the patent. So here is a list of words that we try to avoid, if possible, during drafting of an application. And the reason that we try to avoid these words is these words describe things that are fairly absolute. You know, these things are something that are, for example, one of the terms on here is required. We don't want to say that something is required or it must be there because, again, that can limit the ability of the court to find infringement against a competitor that doesn't have that feature or doesn't have that functionality. So if we say that this term or this functionality is required or use of a specific material is required, if a competitor does not have that functionality or does not use that material, then they are likely outside the scope of the claims because this is what is required for our patent. So terms like summary, define, require, necessary, must, always, mandatory, solely, important, essential, critical, primary, key, vital, all, every, never, none, exactly. These types of terms we don't want to include in our specification. Now, I skipped over very briefly consist of. Now, this term especially has a what we call close-ended interpretation from a legal standpoint for patents. Consist of means only this described group, nothing more. So when we go to talk about claims, a device consisting of element A, B, and C, if the competitor has a device that has A, B, C, and D, that is outside the scope of a claim that uses the term consist of. So this term, the consist of term, is especially dangerous to use in US application drafting. One of the things that we also do when we are drafting applications is we say in some embodiments, the device is something. So if we say in some embodiments, the sensor is a camera, or the sensor includes a camera, this is what we prefer instead of terms like may or can. Because when we say the sensor can be a camera or the sensor may be a camera, there is no positive statement ever that the invention actually, or that the camera is actually the sensor, or that the sensor is the camera. There is no clear requirement that in at least some situations, the sensor is the camera. We're describing possibilities, but we never describe anything that is concrete and definite. And so this can cause some issues with indefiniteness and even in some extreme cases, enablement requirements when the courts review claims for determining the scope. And definitely, we do not want to use any term like can or may in the claim language itself. So that is something that the U.S. examiners will almost sure issue an indefinite or clarity type rejection of that type of language. Avoid creating new reference numbers for the same element from a previous figure. In the USPTO, there is one of the rules that governs the use of reference characters. These are like the numbers that we put into the drawings, right? So you have the drawing, you have the little lines with numbers labeling the individual pieces of the device. The numbers are called reference characters. There is a regulation 37 CFR 1.84P. That's 37 CFR 1.84 and then subsection P, that talks about anytime a reference number or reference character is used, that refers to the same reference character throughout the specification. And anytime that a reference character is used that is different than a previous reference character, that reference character refers to a different element of the specification. So make sure that you correctly maintain the reference characters throughout the description. So if in figure 1 you have element 10 is a processor, we can't have in figure 4 element 10 be a sensor. That violates the USPTO rules, and you're going to get rejections or objections as a result of that. In addition, we shouldn't say the processor 10 for figure 1, and then in figure 3 say the processor 28 if it is the same processor. Now, if they are different processors, that's fine. But if they are the same processor, it should have the same reference number throughout. We don't want to keep repeating the same things over and over and over. This can make it very difficult for the examiner to follow the discussion of what actually is the claimed features, what features are described. If the same information is repeated over and over, it can be very confusing, and it leads to a large application that it is more difficult when it comes to, for example, amending the claims. You may have some new matter rejections simply because there's so much information in the specification, the examiner is unable to identify where in the specification the support for the amended feature comes from. Use different terminology where appropriate. So we don't, if we constantly describe, so that we have a Federal Circuit court case recently that used the term fixed, and that was the basis of the appeal to the Federal Circuit, was what is the meaning of the word fixed. And the patent holder, or the patent applicant, wanted the term fixed to mean it doesn't move. But that is a more narrow interpretation of the word fixed. The word fixed could just mean it's securely attached. And if the patent applicant at the time of drafting the application had said in some embodiments the element is securely attached to the substrate, and then in some embodiments the element is immovable on the substrate, the applicant would have had the ability to use the term immovable in the claims in order to get the specific interpretation that they wanted. So using a variety of ways to describe the features of the invention can be very beneficial, because it gives you more options for drafting your claim language later on when you are facing prosecution with the U.S. examiner. And then, again, one of the things that we will sometimes do in the detailed description is to rewrite the independent claims into the end of the detailed description. So this is kind of like a summary section, but we don't label it as a summary section. But again, it's just the independent claims written as paragraphs instead of in the claim format. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk about the claims. As a general rule, we want to arrange our claims from the broadest to the narrowest. So claim 1 should be the broadest independent claim. This is not a requirement. This is just something that we find is helpful for when we are drafting the claims and during prosecution, to know that claim 1 is likely to be the broadest claim. And so if we can get claim 1 to be distinguishing, the other claims should also be able to be distinguished. This is the next option: have 3 independent and 20 total claims. This is something that is unique to the United States and something that a lot of non-US companies do not take advantage of. In the US, when you pay your fees to the USPTO, you can have 3 independent and 20 total claims for no extra cost. There's no extra cost to have up to 3 independent and 20 total claims. This is something that we should always take advantage of, because it provides the examiner more opportunity to find allowable subject matter, right? We've already paid for all of these claims in our initial filing fees. So we should use them in order to try to increase the odds that the examiner finds allowable subject matter early, and that way we can reduce the cost of the prosecution with the USPTO. In the claims, we want to try to use generic terminology if possible. So going back to our previous example of conductive material and copper, if we say in the specification only copper, 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 using a generic term such as conductive material in the claim is difficult and may create some problems. So if we want to use the word conductive element in the claim, because that is the more generic term, it will cover a wider variety of materials, then in the specification, we need to have support for the more generic claim. So copper, aluminum, tungsten, whatever, some longer list of possible materials. So the broader you want your claim, the more information you need to provide in the specification. We don't want to have the same type of claim for every independent claim. We want to have some sort of variation between the claim scopes for the independent claims because we want the examiner to consider different options. We also don't know what approach the competitors may take when they are attempting to design around our application. And so by providing different claims in different types of claims, we can try to prevent the competitor from designing around or force the competitor to spend more time and money to design around, which then, raises the cost of their product, which makes it less competitive against us. So I think of having different types of claims as kind of like putting road cones on a street. If there is just one claim, just one cone on the street, it's very easy for a car to drive past just the one cone. But if we can put 3 cones across the lane on the street, it becomes much more difficult for the car to get past. It's a similar idea. The more obstacles, the more ways that we can block the competitor, the harder it will be for the competitor to get a product to the market without having to take a license from us. We want to also make sure, as I mentioned before, everything in the claims is supported in the detailed description. Okay? The US is much more relaxed about new matter than a lot of other places because you can rely on the drawings as support if needed, but it is always a better idea to have support in the detailed description if at all possible. As we mentioned before, every feature that is in the claim should be shown in at least one figure. Having the features within the figure also allows us to see different options for how to potentially claim the features. So if we can see in the figure some way that the elements are connected together, if needed, we can put that into the claim without it being in the detailed description. It's better if it's in the detailed description, but we still in the US can rely on the drawings as a support for anything that we add into the claim. So make sure that you have a sufficient number of drawings so that you can have your claims have some sort of variety of scope and have your claims have more options for how to distinguish over any prior art that the examiner identifies. We should have correspondence between at least one method claim and a figure. So we want to have some sort of flow chart. We don't want to have just pictures of a device and then in the claims have a claim directed to a method of using the device. This can be problematic from a enablement standpoint in the US. Going back to something we talked about before, if we are going to claim some sort of number or numerical range in the claims, we want to make sure we have the criticality statement or the reason for this range in the detailed description. This is something that examiners, in my experience, frequently just say, oh, this number range is obvious, without really providing any evidence to support that position. So one of the ways we can argue against that type of rejection is to show that we have a criticality statement or a rationale for the range in the detailed description. So my preference, any range in the detailed description should have a criticality statement. But absolutely any range that is recited in the claim should absolutely have a criticality statement in the detailed description to give you the best chance of overcoming inventive step or obviousness type of rejections. We should avoid a single point number. So we don't want to say wherein the time is 1 minute. We don't want to do this because that makes it very easy for the competitor to design around. If at all possible, we always want to have some sort of range in the claim language. One of the other things, and I think that we're going to talk about this in a little bit, is to claim device claims or apparatus claims in a non-operational state. So this means we want to claim, for example, an electronic device as if there is no power provided to the device. So instead of a term like a light source emitting light, this is an action. The light source only emits light when there is power provided to the light source. We want to say a light source configured to emit light. This means the light source is capable of emitting light, but it is not required that the light source be emitting light at this moment. So if your competitor is selling displays, right, LED or OLED display, when the display is in the box on the shelf at the store, does the competitor's product comprise a light source emitting light? My argument, if I was your competitor, is no, it doesn't. At the time of sale, my light source is not emitting light. Therefore, I do not directly infringe a claim that says a light source emitting light. So that is something that we see quite often, that we recommend avoiding describing apparatus claims in use. We want to describe what the device is, not what the device does. Okay. Method claims should focus on method properties. When we are drafting method claims, we don't want to be describing what the device is. We want to say what the device does. One more thing about method claims is try not to mix method of making and method of using steps. This is something that we have seen with some of the cases that we have filed, where the method claim includes some steps that are performed during manufacturing and some steps that are performed during use. And often this type of claim will be very difficult to infringe because it's a different company that is making the product from the company that is using the product. So basically, when you're talking about your method claims, use the final product as the middle point. Anything before the final product is method of making. Anything after the final product is method of using. So make sure we have a method claim that is only on one side of the final product, either before the final product or after the final product. And going back to one of the first things we said, talking about the claims, using the 3 independent and 20 total claims is if we do this, we can have the opportunity to have a fairly narrow claim that directly covers the commercial product or service that is going to be provided. So this can be a more narrow claim. And the reason that we would want to do something like this is, first of all, if we have extra claims left, right? If we only have, you know, 1 independent and 8 total claims, we have plenty of room to have additional claims. So it doesn't cost any more money. And you can get what is called provisional patent rights. So if a claim is allowed without significant amendment to that claim, so if the claim is filed and then published in the pre-grant publication at the USPTO, and then that claim is allowed and eventually becomes a patent without being significantly amended, the patent owner can get some damages between or the date that the application was published and the date that the patent was issued. If we have to amend the claim significantly, so if we only have broad independent claim 1 and we have to add an extra feature to broad independent claim 1 in order to get that allowed, there are no provisional patent rights. You can only get damages from the issue date of the patent. But if we have a more narrow claim that really targets the product that we intend to sell or the service we intend to provide, and that claim can be allowed without amendment, it is advantageous because we can get a longer term of damages. And you know, the damages will be less, but it's still damages. So having a narrow independent claim is something that is potentially useful at the filing of the application. So the abstract, the final part of the application, and then we're going to talk about some implementation, some example for how to implement some of the things we've talked about. The abstract should be as broad as possible, but consistent with the claims. So typically, what we do for the abstract is we take claim 1 and write claim 1 as a paragraph. So basically the same thing that we talked about doing for the summary section. If we do that for the abstract for just claim 1, that's pretty much what we do. The only difference is that we adjust the language to avoid what the USPTO considers to be legal terminology. So terms like comprising, for some reason, the USPTO considers that to be legal language. So we change comprise to includes, that type of thing. We also don't use the word said in the abstract. We change it to the, if you prefer to draft claims that use said instead of the. The examiner or the USPTO also does not like the term means to be in the abstract. So usually we change it to something like device. The abstract in the US should only be 150 words. Now there is a little bit of allowance, you know, maybe 155 would be okay. But in general, the abstract in the US should be less than, it should be 150 words or less. So typically, one of the things that we remove out of abstracts that we receive in order to avoid objections is often at the end of the abstract in non-US cases, there is a purpose or a goal of the invention. That type of material we typically delete from the abstract. Okay, so now we're going to talk about an example technology that is fairly basic, that you know, you don't have to be a an expert in any sort of technical field to have a general understanding of what is a liquid crystal display. So we talked about previously having different types of claims. So the different types of claims that are available to be captured will depend on what is your technology, what is the invention about. For an LCD, we have many different types of claims that we can draft. So we can have an apparatus claim that has a device and then a sub-combination. So if the inventive feature of our LCD is the backlight module, the lighting element that provides the light to go through the display, we can claim the backlight module by itself. That might be valuable because some competitors may purchase a backlight module from a supplier. So that by having a claim that's directed just to the backlight module, we can target the supplier as a potential infringing company. We can also have a claim that is directed to the system, the overall display that includes the backlight module. This type of claim would target the display manufacturer itself. We can also have a method of making, which again would potentially target the display manufacturer. We can have a method of using, which would potentially claim, some sort of controlling method for how the backlight module is controlled. The method of using would target the end user. So this is something that has value for companies because during negotiations with a customer, you can say, well, we have this patent that protects the method of using aspect. And if you purchase our competitor's product and you use the competitor's product, you're going to be infringing our patent. And we don't want you to infringe our patent. So instead of buying the competitor's product, you should buy our product, and then we can license our patent to you so that you can use our product without infringing any patent. So this is a business negotiation strategy to have a claim that potentially covers a customer as well as a direct competitor. There can also be, for an LCD, articles of manufacture, such as the chip package itself, something like that. You can also have a computer product. So you could have some sort of control system, some sort of computer readable medium that has instructions for controlling the backlight module. So in this type of technology, in the electronics type of technology, applications are very often restricted to a single invention or species. So again, this goes back to one of the things we talked about before. We don't want to say first embodiment, second embodiment, third embodiment. We just want some embodiments. And an invention restriction between an apparatus and a method can be difficult to overcome, and a divisional application would likely be necessary. This does not necessarily mean a bad thing. If your company or your client wants to develop a large patent portfolio, like some of our clients do, one of the things that we do is draft claims to try to get the examiner to make a restriction, so that then we have a reason to file a divisional application, so we can get multiple patents using a single specification. So that's one thing to consider. But if you if your client does not want to file multiple applications, then when you're drafting the claims, think about, well, this is an electronic technology. It's going to be likely to be restricted. I should have all device claims, or I should have all method claims. We can still have differences between the device claims within all of the device claims, and we can have different method claims, but we should separate between method and device in the electronic fields if we're filing. And again, the election of species requirement can be reduced. The risk of that can be reduced by using some embodiments instead of first, second, third embodiments. So here is an example of a species restriction and a way to draft the claim to try to avoid or reduce the risk of a species restriction. So here, if we have a generic claim that's directed to a liquid crystal material, and then we have another independent claim that says a twisted pneumatic material, and a third independent claim that says an in-plane switching material. So the examiner will potentially issue a restriction an election of species requirement between species 1 and species 2. But when the examiner examines the case, the examiner should always examine the generic claim. So when the examiner issues the restriction, we say we choose species 2, and in addition to species 2 being examined, the generic claim of the liquid crystal material will also be examined. If we can get the generic claim allowed and it is still generic, generic means that it covers all of the species. So it covers both the twisted pneumatic and the in-plane switching. If we can have the generic claim allowed, then the examiner will rejoin and also allow species 1. So the examiner would allow all 3 independent claims in this type of situation if we are able to get the generic claim allowed. So how are electronic arts different from mechanical technologies? Well, typically in the electronic arts, there's no physically moving parts. Things typically don't move. And the inventions are usually described based on how signals travel between components. Signals are generated pretty much only when the device is in use. So we want to make sure that we draft an application and draft our claims so that they can be infringed by the manufacturer, especially if the electronic is going to be used by individual people. So if we're going to have, a mobile phone or a laptop computer or something like that that has this LCD within it, we don't want to be suing an individual person. We want to sue the seller, the manufacturer of the device. So when we claim the features in electronic arts, sometimes we use functional language, right? So we say a light source configured to emit light, right? We use this language. And then maybe we say a detector configured to receive the emitted light. Those types of language, that is functional language. We may describe how connections between the components allow the signal to travel. We may use method claims. Again, if your client is interested in maximizing the use of the specification, having device claims and method claims is a great idea. And sometimes we use all of the above. Again, there are 3 ideas above. We can have 3 independent claims based on the US fee structure. Please consider using all of the independent claims. So here is an example. Here is an example of an invention, and we're going to talk about some claiming strategies. So here, the invention is really about this auxiliary electrode here. So we have a data line, we have a scan line, we have a transistor here, this auxiliary electrode, and this pixel electrode. And here is our claim. We have an LCD comprising a scan line, a data line, and a pixel at an intersection of a scan line and data line, and having a transistor coupled to the scan and data lines. So here's coupled to the scan line, coupled to the data line, and a pixel electrode coupled to a drain of the transistor. So here is the pixel electrode coupled to a drain, and an auxiliary electrode coupled to the data line. So here is the auxiliary electrode coupled to the data line. So how the first thing when you're drafting your claims is we want to look back at the claim and see how can we potentially make this claim broader. Well, here we have a drain mentioned in the claim language. Is this necessary? That requires that this transistor be, either a P-type or an N-type transistor. Could a competitor potentially design around the application by changing the type of transistor? So this is something that could potentially be broadened, and we just say a pixel electrode coupled to the transistor and remove the information about the drain. Okay, that's something that we should always look at, is are we adding extra features into our claims that are not necessary? So here is our invention. Here is the known prior art. So clearly we can see the difference is between the location of the electrode. So here, the electrode is on this side of the transistor, and over here, the auxiliary electrode is on the opposite side of the transistor from the pixel electrode. So the claim as initially filed could potentially be rejected based on the known prior art. So we have a transistor coupled to the scan line and data line. So this is here in the known prior art. We have a pixel electrode coupled to a drain of the transistor, is here, and an auxiliary electrode coupled to the data line. So when the transistor is on, a signal can go from the auxiliary electrode to the data line or the other direction. So this could mean the auxiliary electrode at some times in the prior art is coupled to the data line. So how do we avoid the known prior art? Well, there are lots of different options. Okay, so we can say the auxiliary electrode is directly coupled to the data line. So in the known prior art, there is no direct connection. The connection must go through the transistor. We can say an auxiliary electrode coupled to the data line at all times. As we talked about before, this is only when the transistor is conductive, when the transistor is on, that is the only time that there is a coupling between the auxiliary electrode and the data line. We can say wherein the auxiliary electrode is not permanently electrically connected to the pixel electrode. So here, these two options, we're talking about coupling between the auxiliary electrode and the data line. This option, we're talking about coupling between the auxiliary electrode and the pixel electrode. So here, we can say the auxiliary electrode is not permanently electrically connected to the pixel electrode. And that would distinguish over the known prior art. So all of these features are usable to distinguish over the known prior art, but they also do not require any electrical signals to be present. This is something that is potentially infringed by the product on the shelf in the box. So what are some takeaways? If you're operating in the electronics field, be prepared to deal with restriction requirements. Please don't use first embodiment, second embodiment. You want to maintain a generic claim if at all possible. You want to use variations in the claim wording. We just saw on the previous slide 3 different examples to distinguish over the known prior art, and there are many, many more. So we want to consider using different options because each one of those options blocks a design around attempt by a competitor. Consider using method claims and consider defining how the signals will travel through the device. But when you write the claims, if you are writing a device claim, make sure you write the device claim in a non-operational state format. Okay, one more example here. So this is from an actual court case. So the NRE Translogic Technology case. So we have a series of multiplexers. So here we have the multiplexers in green. We have 4 inputs, and we have 3 controls. So the inputs I0 to I3, and the controls S1 to S3. So in the claim language, it says the input signals are variables. Here is the prior art that was identified during the re-examination. We have multiplexers, again, 1, 2, 3. We have 4 inputs in red, and we have 3 controls here in orange. The input signals H and G are undefined in the prior art. Here is the patent claim, or a portion of the patent claim. A multiplexer circuit comprising the first and second signal input terminals coupled to receive first and second input variables respectively. One of the second stage input terminals coupled to the first stage output terminal. So in the US, every term in the claim has to have some sort of meaning. And based on the difference between coupled to and coupled to receive, these 2 connections cannot mean exactly the same thing. Now, they could be very similar, but they cannot mean exactly the same thing. So here, the Federal Circuit and the U.S. Board of Appeals said that coupled to is a defined connection, and that coupled to receive means that the terminal is capable of receiving an input signal only. There is no connection required. There is no clear connection absolutely required. So, since the prior art was different from the invention only in the input signals, the patent claim was determined to be invalid. So, when we are using different terminology in the claims, so here, coupled to receive, these signals and the H and the G, when we talk about the claim language, input terminals coupled to receive first and second input variables, the court said this only means that they are capable of receiving the input signal. It doesn't mean the input signal is actually provided there. So what the patent owner argued is, well, these inputs go in here at 1 and 2, and the control goes in here. And so there is no input terminal that receives the control signal. And the court said, well, the claim does not actually require the input terminals be coupled to the input variables. They only must be coupled to receive, which the court interpreted as capable, structurally capable of receiving. So, what could have been done? How could we have drafted this claim differently in order to avoid the problem that TransLogic ran into? So we could have amended the claims to recite the source of the input signals. We could have amended the claims to recite the connections between the source and the input terminals. One of the problems is this may not directly infringe until the product is actually in use. So that is something to consider. But even if we have this disadvantage, a weak patent is better than no patent, right? Because if we try to get too broad of claims, and even if we can sneak a very broad claim by the US examiner and get that allowed, if that patent gets invalidated, either through an inter partes review or through litigation or something like that, we've lost the patent. What is something that we can do to help protect ourselves? One of the things that we can do is to use our 3 independent and 20 total claims to have a more narrow, safer independent claim. If TransLogic had used that strategy to have a more specific, more narrow independent claim, they may still have a patent. Whereas in this court case, their entire patent was deemed to be invalid. So the coupled to receive language is okay to define the capability of an electronic device, but it should not be relied on to claim the input signals themselves. In order to positively recite the input signals, then there needs to be some sort of amendment to the claims. So that is the end of my presentation. I will now open this up for any questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking your question in English and you want to ask in Chinese, I'm sure that we can get somebody to translate, and I will try my best to answer your question. If you have additional questions about this or other subject matter, this is the email address for our firm, and we welcome any of your questions. And So E, who is a member of Houtman Ham, also can review any questions you send that are written in Chinese. So you don't feel that you need to communicate solely in English with us. We welcome communication in Chinese as well as English. So thank you very much. I hope that this was valuable to you. I hope this was worth staying up late to listen to, and hopefully not too many of you fell asleep while I was talking.
Hi, Josh. Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. So, yeah, wait a minute. Let me also put this background on. Okay, so now it's open for questions. 好，现在那个看看大家有什么问题啊，可以抓住机会，这个向我们那个Josh 博士提出来，好吧 ？Don't be too shy, my friends. And notice that we still have more than 100 people here. Oh, I think we have a question here. Oops.
Well, thank you very much. I have a question about the title. I remember that you mentioned that if we add some specific word to the title, it may narrow the scope of protection. Do you have any court decision talking about this? Because I remember it was cited in maybe a court decision or some kind of guideline but from years ago that those wordings in the title will not limit the scope, and the court will still decide those claim interpretation based on specification. Thank you.
I don't know the court case off the top of my head, but if you let us know how to contact you, we will look that up and give you the example for how that was limited.
OK, cool. 您可以待会儿把那个就在消息框里面发个信息，或者您可以待会儿这个在群里发个信息，或者给我们那个小秘书课程小秘书发都可以，或者直接给我发也都行啊，好不好？谢谢。No problem. You're welcome. I think we have another people who just raised her hand. Maybe it's her or maybe it's him. Please go ahead. 刚才好像还有另一个朋友有问题，那您可以继续，谢谢。Oops. So actually, Josh,
Yes.
I do have a question. I think
Okay.
yeah, you mentioned in your earlier slides that for U.S. patent drafting, there are some kind of a special rules. Especially you mentioned for the field and for example the field part. And my question is how to reconcile the drafting style in US and those in China or in Europe. Sometimes as in China or Europe we may require we describe in the background or in the summary something you might seem unnecessary or even not good practice in US.
So that's a great question, and probably I should have mentioned that during the presentation. one of the things that we do for some of our clients is to modify the application when it comes into the US. So for those of you who do not know, there are two main ways to come into the US from the PCT route. One is the national stage application, and one is by a bypass continuation. Basically, you file a continuation of the PCT into the US. And one of the things that we will do when we file applications, if the client desires, is to modify the specification, either directly if it is a continuation, or using a preliminary or voluntary amendment if it is a national stage application, to change the location where information is provided. So for the field, if there is an advantage or something like that described in the field, we'll move that information down into the detailed description. If in the background there is a description of a problem with the prior art, we will move that information along with the description of the improvement, which typically happens in the summary section, move those two things together down into the detailed description to describe an advantage of the current application. These are some of the things that we do in order to reduce the risks that come from, you know, applications being drafted different than the U.S. style. And like I said before, I don't want to sound like the European or the Chinese way is the wrong way. It's just a different way from the U.S.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's why it said the detailed description of a US patent application is a meat.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Yeah, Suo Yi, would you mind convey the message from Mr. Zhu Chunye to Josh?
Yeah. John, here is a question from the student. He is asking for the abstract. If we use the whole language from the claims, will there have some disadvantages for this?
Well, first off, the abstract can only be 150 words, and so sometimes the claims are longer than 150 words. So that's something that needs to be adjusted. Also, usually the claim language uses the term comprising. That needs to be adjusted. But otherwise, that's the only change that I would make between the broadest independent claim and the abstract. Basically, when I draft a patent application, I cut and paste the broadest independent claim to the abstract and then just format it so that it's written like a normal paragraph. That's all I do. And, make the change to comprising and stuff like that. But otherwise, that's the only changes that I make.
Thank you,
Do
Josh.
you want to translate the answer?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. We believe Professor Gong from DUT has a question. So,
Okay.
Professor Gong, would you please go ahead?
Okay, thank you for Josh for your wonderful lecture. Also, I'm not a major in. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Also, I'm not a major in patent, but I should be more great interest into your lecture. And according to your PPT, you just said that preferable limited to 3 or 2 claim. That means the 3 or 2 claim is very preferable claim for the application to do that. And sometimes maybe there's seldom cases. They have I just see some cases. They have the patent claim for 100. And it's typical for Canada. It's one of the Canada cases.
Oh, I'm kind of.
It's about the energy. The new
Excuse me,
energy.
Professor Gong. I think your connection is not good. Would you mind try rephrasing your question again? I think your connection is not very good.
Okay. First, I'm to great thank you for Jeffrey's wonderful information and wonderful lectures. I'm not a major in patent and something like that, but I'm greatly interested in patent because I was a professor of IP and also a patent, and also the patent is very important for the companies.
应该做标建立。那如果是说对文件它不是这么建立，那我可以等同分，因为在另一种做标器，那就左右之间，然后或者是这个对应点啊。
Excuse me，sorry，是不是谁没有静音？就现在如果没有提问的，就是把静音一下，好不好？谢谢。对。
My question is that you just in your PPT said suggestion is a claim prefer limited to 3 to 20 claims, and then this is all pay for increase odds for allowable stuff. That is if the patent have the 3 or 20 claims.
So I think I know what you're asking, that the connection is a little bit issues, but so the government fees that you pay when you file a U.S. patent application covers 3 independent and 20 total claims, and so you're allowed to use that many without paying any additional fees. If we have more than that, so if we have 4 independent claims, there is an additional fee associated with that. If we have 21 total claims, there is an additional fee associated with that. The notation 3/20 is something that we use to say 3 independent and 20 total claims. We recommend that you use 3 independent and 20 total claims because you've already paid for that. But unless there's a really good reason to pay extra fees to have more independent or more total claims, then there's no reason to go beyond the 3 and 20 most of the time. With respect to the 3 and 20 claims providing a more opportunity for the examiner to find allowable subject matter, think of it this way. If you go into a restaurant and there are 7 items on the menu, maybe you find something you like, maybe you find something you do not like. If you go into the restaurant next door and there are 20 items on the menu, the chance that you find something that you like is much higher than at the 7-item restaurant. And that's what we're doing for the examiner. We're providing the examiner with 20 options to find allowable subject matter instead of only filing 6 or 7. And so by providing the 3 independent and 20 total claims, we are giving the examiner different combinations, different wordings, hoping that the examiner will find something that they like and that they are willing to allow early in the process. I hope that answers your question. That was my understanding of what you were asking.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. For another thing, for some company or some their technology, they make application for 100 claim. Maybe they make up a very strong protection for the technology or not. That is, the more claim on the better, or the more claim the more strong protection system of the technology? Can we see that?
So obviously the more claims you have, the more variations that you can cover. But to put 100 claims into one application, this would really, in my opinion, be determined based on the technology that you are patenting. If it is a technology that moves very, very fast, cloud computing or cryptocurrency or things like this that change daily, sometimes hourly, then maybe if this is a very essential application, maybe there's a reason to have 100 claims in a single application. If, on the other hand, this is a technology that moves a little bit slower, my recommendation in the US would be to file the application, find out what the examiner is willing to allow, and then in the US, you can file an unlimited number of continuation applications. And so once we see what the examiner is willing to allow, we can file a second application with the same specification and a new set of claims in order to try to cover some of that additional material. That's again, it really depends on that. That's kind of a business decision, not as much a legal decision. So it depends on what type of technology there are and what is the strategy of the business. But that would be kind of my general recommendation, is to, if it's something that moves very, very fast technology, and this is a very key essential application, then a large number of claims may be justified. Other than that, I would recommend to use the ability to do continuations to get the additional claims in the US, because the fees, once you I think I can look up real quick what the additional fee is for a independent claim, but it's pretty significant if I remember correctly. So let me see here. So for a large company, a company with 500 or more employees, each independent claim above 3 costs an extra $480. So it is quite expensive. And each regular claim, each claim in above 20 costs an extra $100. So if you add a fourth independent claim, that makes 21 total claims. That's $580 for just that one claim in government fees.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joseph.
So, Soyi, would you please go ahead with Vivian's question? Okay, I think Josh.
So I see a question that just popped up. Okay.
Yes.
So so the generic claim is a way to try to get the claims rejoined. As I mentioned before about the election of species, avoiding in the description talking about first embodiment, second embodiment, that type of language reduces the risk of an election of species requirement. Along those same lines, I would avoid saying things like alternative embodiment or other embodiment. Typically, when I am drafting, I say some embodiments all the time. Those are things to reduce the risk of restriction and election of species requirements. I don't know that we want to get into it too much in this discussion, but when the examiner issues a invention restriction or an election of species requirement, the examiner has to provide some evidence that there would be a burden on the examiner to search both of the species or all of the species. And so the examiner attempts to separate the claims. And so if you can provide some sort of argument for why there is not a serious burden on the search, then we can try to argue against the election of species or the invention restriction. But we must elect in response to the requirement from the examiner. There's no opportunity to just argue. There must be an election in response to the examiner's restriction requirement.
George, we have one more question. So it has
Sure.
translated into English.
Did I miss it?
Now, I mean, we have a new one. So it just types
Okay.
whether it is possible in the same application to include both the equipment claim and the method of manufacturing the equipment.
It's possible, depending on what the technology is. You know, if it's a chemical area, probably the examiner will not do a restriction requirement. But if it's more of a mechanical area or a electronic type of area, then the examiner will more likely do a restriction requirement.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another lady who just raised her hand. Let me see where she is.
还有一种就是说跟他约电话讨论，这个刚才是。
Hi, Josh. May I ask you one more question about the restriction
Sure.
requirement?
Sure.
I find it hard to persuade the examiner with no serious search and examination burden. Could you please give me some tips on how to present some facts about no serious search burden? Or do you often argue against or just elect without traverse?
So again, this goes back to there's multiple ways to respond. So I agree with you. Persuading the examiner to withdraw a restriction requirement is difficult. So I would say the odds of success are maybe about 20 to 25%. One of the things that I will do is, so for example, for the clients who like to have a numerous patents, the strategy that we use for them is we will draft the claims and hope that the examiner makes a restriction. When the examiner makes a restriction, we will elect, say, the device claims, and then we will cancel the method claims and add new device claims. And so that the examiner still is examining 20 claims. So this is a little bit more of an advanced of a strategy for having 20 claims considered by the examiner. If you choose to do something like this, make sure that you cancel, not just withdraw, but cancel the claims that you do not want to pursue. So if we have claims 1 through 10 that are method claims, 1 through 10 that are method claims, and 11 through 20 that are device claims, if we elect the method, then we will cancel 11 through 20, and we will add new claims 21 through 30 that are method claims. And this way, the examiner still has 20 claims to examine. And there is not any additional claim fees for this because we canceled 11 through 20. So there are still only 20 total claims pending. And that's why I say you need to cancel the claims you do not elect, not just allow them to be withdrawn. Because if they are just withdrawn and we add 21 through 30, then we will pay for 10 extra claims. So think of it as withdrawn claims. If we're talking about, for example, a basketball team, withdrawn claims are like the players who are sitting on the bench. They're not playing right now, but they are still part of the team and they still count as team members. Canceled claims are they're kicked off the team. They're no longer on the team. So that's kind of the difference between withdrawn and canceled claims. Does that help? If I could persuade the examiners to do whatever I wanted, then that would be amazing. But that just doesn't happen. And like you said, persuading examiners to withdraw restriction requirements is difficult. That's why it's better to try to draft the application to avoid or reduce your risk of those types of restriction requirements if that's what your client's goal is.
Yep, that's very wonderful. And Mimi, the comparison. So any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, I think we should stop here because I think George has spent a very long time lecturing, and thank you so much. And it's getting late as well here. Okay, so let me make a concluding remarks. And again, thank you, Josh, for this wonderful, detailed practical lecture. I think everybody learned something here, and we are looking forward to having you again on Friday at the same time. So, ladies and gentlemen, keep an eye on our notice, and we wish you all to join us again to meet Josh. So, if we have no more question, then let's conclude here. And again, we all thank Josh for this wonderful, lecture. And so, see you next time, everybody. Josh, have a good day ahead. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
Bye.
Josh.
Yeah. Bye bye, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye.
Take care. Take care.
Bye bye.